jump right in.
Okay, we're recording.
Yeah.
So, hi Martin. Slightly different this time because we're doing this on a Monday rather than I think all the others have been a Saturday.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it'll go out the same as they've been going out anyway.
Mm.
It just feels different for us, having a weekday vibe rather than a weekend vibe, and that the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, being that you managed to get out of town for a weekend, and you were just telling me you've been up a mountain.
Yeah, quite a celebration of all the softening down of the lockdown.
Yeah.
Something that didn't feel as a very common thing, or if even if as you were doing that, as I was doing that, it didn't feel like something right entirely. I was hesitant on the move. You know, I was in my car driving out. I was with a couple of other people, planning to go up a mountain and then discover and see what kind of retreat we can do, what sense we can make of that. And there was this slight feeling of something unfinished or even prohibited or even wrong to a certain extent. And no one was really able to tell why, but probably explaining away intellectually, this is because of the lockdown. We are very used to that. There's some kind of reflex to not doing all of that, going out of town or just walking. But I'm quite hesitant, and I'm wondering if that's the case with this, because it sounds like too mental of an endeavor just to explain it away. There must be something more to that. But
it's very neat, isn't it? I understand it. I get it. I've had more than one session with people I'm working with where the images come up from whomever it happens to be at the time of the whatever this is, because there isn't really a name for it. So people are talking about easing of lockdown or coming out of lockdown, or the sort of sudden switching off or fading of lockdown. It's a very I would say kind of liminal space, except that's kind of an overused term perhaps these days, but there's something liminal about it. But people have used, I can think of 3 people I've been working with last week who used this image, that it's like coming out of a cave and sort of looking around, and your eyes, or that sensation that people often have if you've been in the cinema, which is, remember the days where you could go to the cinema. That doesn't happen anymore. But you'd come out and maybe your eyes have adjusted to being sat in the dark, generally speaking, and then you come out. And for a moment, it's confusing. You don't know what time of day it is. You might step out into a brilliant summer day, but you're sort of still in a cave on some level. And maybe there is a little bit of that at the physiological level, at the level of the way we inhabit our form and the way our senses work about this this period of lockdown changing, let's say. And going with that, I think in every case I can think of right now, people have quickly followed it by saying, there's something delicious about the freedom that wasn't there a week ago, to go and taste the mountain or walk somewhere I haven't been. But also there's a sense of this could change again very quickly. So we might be back in lockdown in a couple of weeks' time. That seems to be also still in the mix. And of course, thinking of it with the mind, that's the big uncertainty, isn't it? There are no maps for this. We don't really even understand the nature of the virus and its behaviors, and how it can be so apparently specific / random in its effect for different people, even if they're kind of stood right next to each other. So we don't do well at handling multiple nuance like that. Yeah. But coming out of a cave, that's a heck of a thing, isn't it? That's deep in that's millions of years of evolution have primed us for that kind of experience.
I suppose a major part of the genetic, let's call it, matrix, it's organized around that. Even claustrophobia by itself, I do highly suspect that claustrophobia is the urge to get out, because there was hundreds of thousands of years where we thrived and lived and we reproduced and survived in caves.
Yes.
But then at one point, and I've always been puzzled by this. I'm trying to imagine the exact second where one of the Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens sapiens,
Yes.
saying, "Whew, I need to get out. This is crushing. This is too much. There's a lot of weight on my senses," and then really
Yeah.
survival instinct. And
Yeah.
it's not stay here because they will eat you, supposedly the predators outside,
Yes.
but go out. They might eat you, but it's up to you
Yeah.
not to allow them to eat you, but at least not immediately. At one point, probably, but
Yeah.
there's no time.
So you could say it's kind of, it's another level, another take, another much further back in prehistoric layering of the psyche of the primal scene. Except this primal scene is birthed from a cave, literally coming out. Yeah, and probably cohabiting that cave with some of those very creatures, but in their sleeping phase. The bear isn't going to eat me if it's asleep, or if it's it's taking that side of the cave and I'm taking this side of the cave. Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, there's a lot there. We could spend hours just exploring. Yeah, and how in some traditions the cave, particularly certain meditative traditions, the cave is extrapolated into the skull. So that's the cave that we're really in. The sense of our own, skull and the various kind of functionings of glands and organs within the structure of the brain itself, representing emergence from darker states, more ignorant states, into light and enlightened states, you could say. So it's an inner event as well as this outer one.
The meat of the mind, as I found that sentence somewhere. The
Great
meat
sentence.
of the mind is.
Write that down. Yeah.
I was reading something about the philosophy of mind. It's a sub-branch of philosophy, let's say, but there's a lot of psychological work there, a lot of anthropological work. Doesn't really exhaust the subject of the mind, because it's a very over-exaggerated idea that the mind is the only thing ever existing in terms of perception and synthesis.
Yes.
But there are two main schools of thought around thought. Theory about the theory that the mind produces. And one of them says that the mind-body problem, as they call it, it's as if it's not existent. Mind controls and is controlled by body, but the other wing or the other branch of these people, the other end of the spectrum, they say, oh, no, this is a complete nonsense, and mind is just a mistake of evolution. We are not really allowed to be here in this state as we are in. And just switching back to several minutes ago, one of the things that we did on this retreat was visit a cave.
An actual cave.
Actual physical cave. Quite an extraordinary experience, very mystical, but not in the mystifying mystical, but really of being in connection with the place and really producing something is born out of you being there. Something new emerges. And coming out of the cave was really having this dizzy feeling, your eyes, you're trying to adjust your focal length to see where the other person is. Light is almost burning into your senses. I was thinking that there's some kind of, let's say, phenomenon, but I'm not really sure if it's phenomenon, but today's contemporary science relies on the eyes to enlighten the brain. So light and truth, let's say, because I do equate them on some level. Light and truth, they enter through the eyes for the contemporary scientists. But for this quite dense, quite complex meat of the mind, you cannot provide enough light. Only through the holes of the eyes, through the eye sockets, and the eye socket is quite big, but the pupil is tiny. It cuts light when it's too much,
Yeah.
and it searches for light quite desperately when
Yes.
it's not enough.
Yes.
So relying on the eyes, on the visual, on the light beam to enlighten the meat of the mind,
Yes.
I think that's nonsense.
Yeah.
in some,
Yeah.
on some level, of course, the people are quite visually driven.
Yes.
I remember Jordan Peterson explaining something quite curious when I heard it the first time, even amusing, that if there's a group of people in a room and one of them stands up and goes to the corner and just looks at it like that without saying anything, 10 minutes in, everyone in the room will be like that, looking at the point. So probably at one level of functioning, the visual enlightening of the meat of the mind, way to go. That's
Yes.
completely fine and perfect. But
Yes.
I'm wondering about the extra, but even
Yeah.
not to make it magical, if it's not needed, but the extra sensory stimulation of the
Yeah.
enlightenment
Yeah.
of the whole system.
Yeah.
But what sense do you make of that? Because this is
Well, it reminds me, we touched on this before, whenever it was, some weeks ago, somewhere in passing in this conversation to me feels like it's almost outside of time, really, and
mm,
space. It's always happening, and
yeah,
sometimes it's literally happening, and the rest of the time it's just implied or it's sat behind. It's like being in some sort of bardo between states. So somewhere within that flow, we've touched on this before, and it comes from lots of the Indian philosophical and spiritual traditions that don't have universal agreement, as far as I understand it, but there's certainly a strong view within that, what emerges from that direction, that sound is more primary than light. So that
mhm,
it's, you find it in things like the, if people have all heard of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, as it's sometimes translated. And it shows up there as well, quite practical and tangible there, because the sense is that each of our physical senses and some of our subtler mind senses rest upon certain elements at a gross level and at a subtle level, and that as consciousness withdraws from the form, so as somebody dies or undergoes their dying time, it's quite a beautiful image that there's this sense in which the different senses absorb back into one another.
mm,
There's a whole sequence of what absorbs into what, and you can recognize this by observing the person's dying, how far into the dying they are, because it may go on over quite a long period of time. But the last sense to go, the last one to disappear, um, is hearing. Yeah, hence the book is an oral thing. It's not really a written text that you use your eyes
mm,
to see. It's an oral thing that you speak to the dying and then the deceased, and you continue to speak for 49 days, because subtly, at least in those who attained some kind of, knew what they were doing with these absorption states, their hearing, their capacity to still hear, might linger for anything up to that amount of time after their physical, after a doctor would have signed the death certificate and said this person is dead, there's no brain function, there's no heart, there's no pulse, there's no breathing, the person is dead, they've expired. It's like, not quite. Something is still operative, as if they have withdrawn ever more subtly into you could say, the cave in that metaphor. Um, yeah, and that plays out almost in reverse in terms of the formation of a life as well. That the subtle arising of a life that eventually manifests as the union of a sperm cell and an egg, that then gives rise to the fetus and the developmental stages of that are that in reverse, are the arising of um, these kind of elemental forms wrapping themselves around, and then we have that. Gosh, my memory's not good enough to pull it up in the time I need it. The way our development recapitulates biological development
mhm,
in fish, birds, and so forth,
yeah,
reptiles, and then eventually into mammals, primates, and then as you said, Homo sapiens. Yeah, yeah. So there's a huge amount that's implied in all of that. There's also the sense, again, from the Indian tradition that would have it, and I think this does exist in the Western tradition too, it's just more forgotten and sort of underground or back in the cave. But there is the sense in which our senses, they're not ours. That would be one way of saying it from a like a Vedic point of view. So my sight is not my sight, actually. It's the way in which divinity perceives itself. It doesn't belong to me. And if I go looking for it and try and claim ownership of it, I'm simply pickpocketing reality. And someone said to me last week, it was really beautiful, kind of mind-slapping kind of insight, really. Probably pretty commonplace, but it landed for me really well. And he said, this was the way of saying it, exactly on what we're speaking about. So you have 7 rishis living in your face, meaning 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, 1 mouth.
Yeah.
And literally that each opening, each orifice is inhabited by a divinity. It's a kind of idea of a body mandala in various, particularly tantric practices, that there are deities that keep the threshold, as it were, and that the human experience from the point of view of consciousness is a way of experiencing itself. Self experiences self. So to be biased towards seeing makes no sense at all, other than from the inside of a human, the tensions and conflicts and frictions with our kind of ego psychology, you could say. Or to put another kind of flavor on it, I was rereading bits of Almaas recently. One of his greater books, The Point of Existence is the title of the book. And there's a chapter in there, I think it's chapter 36, if I remember rightly. It's in the final third of the book, because it's a great chunk of a thing. And it's a chapter on what he calls individuation narcissism. And yeah, it's sort of occupying this territory. So he's explored many layers and types of narcissism. And then he gets to individuation narcissism. And it's this experience of oneself. His kind of metaphor for it is that we experience ourselves, if we're able to get there, as being like a donut, that there's nothing in the middle, that there's this hollow or empty space where I had formed my identity and taken myself to be full. When I really perceive through it, I realize that is another layer of narcissism. It's not there. It's an emptiness, which is also a fullness. But until it's seen through, then I am susceptible to, I guess, either my own inner and inward manipulations or those of others, playing upon, certain games, you could say, identity games. Yeah, it's a really profound crescendo of an already very profound book, but it suddenly just goes up to another level. It's where he changes gear, really, from a sort of masterful retelling of object relations and developmental psychology, and he's kind of honored that, paid his dues, laid it out, and then it's sort of going into warp drive where it crosses some sort of event horizon and becomes more explicitly a spiritual context for the thing. So if anyone has that book, check out chapter 36. Yeah, individuation narcissism is where it's at.
Because you mentioned ego psychology, I was reading something and I was quite amazed to find that supposedly the founding father of ego psychology, Heinz Kohut,
Kohut, yeah.
Who is greatly valued in the psychosynthesis tradition, at least, but I can remember not deepening it from that perspective. I was probably studying that from the psychoanalytic perspective that I'm coming from at certain times of my life. But I can remember in the psychosynthesis training, Kohut was greatly appreciated for his idea of a unifying center. Not quite literally, but as someone that discovered the same thing via some other path of discovery and exploration.
Yes.
I was reading something about him the other day, It was more of a biography-based information, and why did he came up with the idea that he came up with, because
Yes.
of some life event that's connected to that, or just connecting the dots between them. And because he's was born in Vienna, 1913, as far as I can remember, but then moved to New York and then made its way up to Chicago,
Mm.
and then tried to enroll in a psychoanalytic training. But he was, I think he never entered therapy or analysis as it was one of the options back then. So people from the institute in Chicago refused to enroll him in a training, and then he found an analyst. Quite a curious connection there. The analyst he found, uh, he was one of Hyman Spotnitz's supervisors. So Hyman Spotnitz is one of the people working with severely psychotic people,
Yeah.
ditching the idea of interpretation and really going for the mirroring in for the therapeutic attunement
Yes.
approach. But me personally, I really like this as in terms of how people relate generally. But I think the name of the supervisor of Spotnitz and the analyst of Kohut was someone Akon, that around the
Uh-huh.
60s was a president of the American Psychoanalytic
Okay.
Association, something like that. But he wrote a book on troubled adolescents. It was called back then. So this was this small group of extremely violent male
Yes.
adolescent boys that he gathered in some kind of establishment and as a house up in the mountains or something like that.
Yes.
And he's been famous for his quite extraordinary success in treating those boys.
Hmm.
People were really amazed. Is he lying? Is he doing something weird? But he was really approaching them from this specific
Yeah.
point of view of authority can go screw itself.
Yeah.
I'm like you, I'm troubled also, I might be a grown-up, but
Yes.
you hate the world for being so hostile, so you're hostile
Yeah.
with me. I'm the same. And this produced extraordinary results.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that Akon's book on the outcome of everything, the preface of the book is written by Freud himself.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this is something like a history event.
Isn't it?
But following that line of connection, so Freud, Akon, his wife that introduced Kohut to Akon, and he
Yeah.
enrolled him in analysis, and then the Chicago Institute took
Yeah.
him for training. They had quite an extraordinary connection through analysis, through therapy, and through some kind of cultural values.
Yes.
And so you can find Akon's writings and thoughts and Kohut's writings directly connected to the Delphi Oracle
Yeah.
philosophy. So there's many ideas around that, and the
Yes.
ego psychology really ditches the idea of Freud that narcissism is a kind of transference that's unanalyzable, untreatable.
Yes. Yes.
But Kohut says, no, 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 that's a completely different kind of transference. And I do think that he touched upon something quite spiritual there in
Yes.
psycho-spiritual development, but
Yes.
probably stopped himself because of the danger of being expelled
Yeah.
even at one
Indeed.
point.
Very real danger.
Yeah, yeah. But back then this was really, but there's something around that, and the ego then took a completely different form
Yes. Yes.
and an understanding of it.
Yes.
And he even connected to the subject of sound. And I even
Yes.
reminded me he was using a classical methodology of the framework, sitting. There was a couch and people were laying down and really going
Yeah.
through whatever. And at one point where they were extremely frightened, he wasn't the one to put a barrier and say, why are you frightened, or
Yeah.
something, or some kind of interpretation.
Yes.
He, he was sticking out his two fingers for people to hold, not
Uh-huh.
to be afraid. But the thing that I'm trying to get to here is that each and every one, the analyst or the therapist and the person that's being troubled, they were only hearing the other.
Yes.
Kohut was describing his own
Yes.
therapies that he was conducting as looking at the ceiling, only
Yeah,
listening. And
yeah,
the people talking, they were seeing the ceiling again, hearing his breathing or anything, and hearing their own voice.
yeah,
So there's probably something very dramatic of hearing and sound
yeah.
connected to ego anyway. There's a bridge there.
There really is. That's very profound. That reminds me, years ago, I did a course on the intersection between spiritual psychology and Jewish mysticism.
Yeah.
It was one of these kind of online, when what were they called? MOOCs, I think they were called, these mass online, uh,
Mhm.
where you could just sign up with courses at pretty much any university in the world, and it was free. I mean, I think they still exist, a lot of them, but at that point, they were really this kind of efflorescence of stuff. Yeah, I signed up for a whole raft of things just to check out the method, really. I think I did volcanology
Nice.
because that had always interested me as a kid. I thought, why not? It's there. And of course, yeah, it's just way too, assumed way too much prior knowledge to really succeed very far with that. But it was still very interesting to do. I did one on early music and the origins of notation and early musical languages and instrumentation. That was really fascinating. Sort of a history of the arising of certain cultural tendencies in the West, really, through the study of the arising of musical notation, starting with the voice. But the one I really enjoyed the most was this. Yeah, I forget the exact title, but the meat of it was um, the influence of Jewish mysticism on psychological thought. And it was, I think, the University in Jerusalem was the host for it. But yeah, one of the takeaway points there that kept recurring time and time again was the primacy of the oral tradition and the absolute gold standard of the seal of the prophets, as it were, in Judaic tradition and history, is you don't behold God, you hear God. So if you really are the chosen of the divine, it's in here that it
Mhm.
comes to you as a voice that is not an inner voice and is not your voice, but is, yeah, the voice of the divine, of the beyond, of the Lord. Um, and it was really clear, and the impact of that on psychological awareness, rather than the visual, seems yeah, pretty extreme and extraordinary. Really, something to conjure with. But coming back to the even bigger point, batting big
Mhm.
points around here, but the one about the mind and the place of the mind and the primacy of the mind. Um, I suppose, yeah, lots of spiritual traditions would end up in a position that would say something like, the mind is not the tool for the job. So the mind will
Mhm.
never understand, never be capable of understanding that which gives rise to the mind. Which I guess is why everyone can agree on definitions of the brain, but
Yeah.
there are no shared definitions of what the mind is. There are
Mhm.
lots of descriptions of the contents or certain mechanics of mind, but there's no universally accepted or always true definition of the mind itself as the mind, because you'd have to somehow be outside the mind to perform anything like an objective scientific rendering of the mind, um, which, yeah, has so far proved beyond us. Um, but it's not considered problematic in lots of traditions. So it depends what we even mean by mind, doesn't it? I mean, I think my understanding of it from Buddhism, and I think again from the kind of traditions that we tend to misname as Hindu, but don't really understand themselves in that terminology. But yeah, say the Vedas or the Upanishads or something of that kind, or the Brahminical tradition,
Mhm.
would say that mind. So there's the Sanskrit word for mind, you could say, might be chitta, that sort of ordinary mind, or the mind itself, mind as everyday mind. But then there's another kind of mind which tends to be called buddhi, which sometimes gets translated as intellect. But whatever we translate it as, it's not a higher order of the same mind. It's an entirely different thing. And one of its qualities is that it's utterly impersonal. It's completely transpersonal. So it's the way by which that sort of understanding of the world would explain how you can know things that you can't possibly know. because you don't arrive at them through inference or deduction or logic or some operation of, mental gymnastics. It's a field dynamic. If your consciousness is available to the field, then you know things when you need to know them without knowing how you know them, and then they go again. They're not like filed in some computer memory bank kind of. It's a different order of knowing, and certainly that was part of the thinking, not just the thinking, part of the deep understanding and commitment of Assagioli, for example. It's explicitly part of the understanding of the theosophical tradition as a borrowing from the Hindu tradition, maybe slightly changed in translation, maybe arguably misunderstood to some degree, and certainly fused into a kind of mystic Christian understanding as well. So it changes it. But they're forever talking about the Buddhic plane and the way the different elements of soul reside on the Buddhic, and that infers something to the parts of us that are embodied. But from you could say a tantric point of view, you don't even need that kind of middle management accounting system, bean counting for it. It's simply that it's all in the nature of the divine, really, and the consciousness that can apprehend that isn't personal, doesn't belong inside the confines of the skull or the skin. It's a dynamic that's beyond that can't really say anything about it. It's the I am in the earlier tradition. Which has no problem coming to a point, being an I am this or an I am that. But the emphasis being on the am, the amming of I am. Or to play with a word, so we've got that English word am, I am, and there's a lot of kind of mantra in Sanskrit, like soham, which is often attached to the breath. So when you breathe in, you imagine or visualize or hear so as the sound, and as you breathe out, ham as the sound. So ham becomes this sort of foundational in-out singularity, unity, and then duality experience, moving in and out, never other than one, but sometimes two. But then you also there's a word in Sanskrit, ahamkara, K-A-R-A on the end, ahamkara, which I've seen translated probably a bit clumsily, lazily, as ego in some, riffs on certain passages in things. But I think, I don't, I'm not blessed with the linguistics to understand Sanskrit myself, but those who know these things and those who I've leaned on and trusted on that, in that regard, would say a more accurate translation of ahamkara would be I maker. So that which permits or creates the possibility of an I arising, of an apparently separate self, as a necessary function of being a human. So we would say, from a sort of ego end of psychology, you need an ego. You can't get out of bed in the morning. You can't make a plan. We couldn't be doing this right now unless there was a certain amount of ego in play that would be able to locate itself in space and time and have a memory to be able to use language and traverse duality in that way. But I really rather something that requires more thinking and more research. But I really like the door that has ahamkara written on it. It feels like one that there's a lot to be explored behind. I maker, or the I maker, or I making capacity. Seems like it's a verb, isn't it? It's a doing. Something is happening through it. Which doesn't. It's not as sticky as when the thing becomes like the ego as a proper noun like that. It's like it now has a territory and a domain, and it possesses things, and it is interested in defending its possessions or adding to them. Whereas I maker, maybe this is just my own bias, but it feels more in the nature of an artist. One who is allowing this creative force to move through and perhaps at best be playful with.
When you said that, I make a
Mm.
this is one of the other points that we touched upon, of the properties of language,
Yes.
and how it has probably a very hidden history that we're not really allowed, or we're unable to see.
Yes.
But also there's a limitation. What Ludwig Wittgenstein would say, that this is a series of games,
Mm.
and not ever in accord with the other person, but we can make a social adjustment to what kind of game are we playing with language, and then this is understandable.
Yeah.
But when you said I make a, I had these two split ideas in my mind. Is it in terms of the I, the center of awareness maker,
Mm-hmm.
or is it in terms of the oculus organ of visual perception maker?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I had this quick thought-like process of, I was reading something around, as always, I'm very in love with linguistics, and this is quite a field,
Yeah. Yeah.
profound field, as every other else, but this is what's engaging me most
Yes.
recent years. And the word I,
Yes.
as it exists right now in contemporary English, comes from something that's in the center of a process. So that the syntax of
Yes.
the idea and the semantics of the idea is that there's something undefinable that's in the center of a
Yeah.
process that's happening around it.
Yeah.
But I was researching two very similar definitions with only a syllable of difference. And this syllable was one of the things that really opened a completely new horizon, because one of the definitions was by an online dictionary and one was by offline dictionary, so paperback.
Yes.
The online dictionary said, as a definition, that I is the undefinable center that's happening in the center of evolution,
Mm.
which is curious by itself.
Mm.
But the other definition was exactly the same.
Ah.
I, something that's happening in the center of a revolution.
Ah.
And this is much more like it, because the revolution, not in the contemporary sense of riots, as
Yes.
everything that's happening in the US, not as like that. I see it more as a revolution, as the point from which you emerge,
Yes.
then you explore a little bit, and then you have to go back to the source just to
Yeah.
either recharge your batteries or really harvest the knowledge of this diameter, then get back and give it to the people.
Yeah. Yeah.
If it's supposedly a nation or some kind
Yeah.
of a tribe or anything.
Yeah.
And
Which is, I mean, that's an eternal story, isn't it? Bringing something back, as it were, from the mountaintop. That's the one version, or from the depths, the back of the cave, the descent into the underworld and coming back. But in each version of it, you come back with something that is a kind of revelation, fruit of revolution in that particular technical sense. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yes.
so I make a
Yeah.
this is
Yeah. As with anything in Sanskrit as well, I mean, likelihood is it will have a huge amount more subtlety and poise, and the translation obscures in those regards. It just becomes a new thing. Not that there's not validity in it. I'm desperately reliant on it, but yeah, the notions of languages like that being, in a sense, sacred speech, or even, you know, if you push it further than that, the speech, the sounds, the syllables of that speech, the seed syllables of that speech being that which calls forth creation, that pulls universes into being, you could say, literally coded into the language itself. So you can't kind of go in and order a McDonald's in Sanskrit, but you can call forth the cosmos and honor it, sing its hymn. as it were, which is the point. It's about, yeah, the dignity of the thing and the joy, the bliss of the thing, the celebration of it. You know, why create an eye? Why have an eye maker other than to sing back to the pleroma, as you might have called it? Yeah.
But as with it, this is supposedly a very psychosynthesis-based idea, but as with everything that's on this side of the spectrum, there's probably something else.
Yeah.
I was thinking that if there's the eye maker kind of a establishment or machinery, let's say, the opposite might be either the eye destroyer or the you destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm quite hesitant which one of the two it might be. So if you choose to engage with the eye maker in yourself, because I do highly believe that we are born with the potential of really establishing a coherent ego.
Yes.
In terms of the ego psychology that
yes.
But then if you go for it, if you go for the eye maker process, this is, in my opinion, inevitably connected to the you destroyer process.
Yeah, certainly. And it's, how could you say it? It's like one of the mistakes, you could say, in psychology, and it might be a very fortunate or necessary mistake, but the maybe not even in psychology, but it relates to psychology. That this notion you hear all the time, contemporary spirituality, new age circles, and on and on and on, and even in pop psychology, you know, these days. You hear it all the time in like kind of business coaching kind of world. It's like, you just got to surrender your ego. You just got to defeat your ego, tame your ego. It's always that kind of language.
Yeah.
And it's a mistake, clearly. The beauty of the eye maker thing is that's not what it's saying at all. It's saying what we're translating that part of it into ego is itself nothing other than divinity. And the eye destroyer, as you were just positing then, which is very much in the iconography of that world, the wrathful or destructive face, Shiva dancing, creation and destruction, all in the single point. Or, you know, wrathful goddesses, that's usually the form that it's manifested in. Kali, certain kind of Durga forms, that kind of thing, or Vajrayogini in the Buddhist tantras, and on and on. They're offerings. It's like the point of having made an eye is to allow it to be a continual moment by moment celebration and offering to the deities. It literally comes down to hospitality. That's where my current understanding of it sits. It's like, how hospitable are we to that which made us, makes us, sustains us? How do we feed the 7 rishis in our face or anywhere else in our being, and honor them? And with what would we feed them? It's not with literal material substances. It's with, knowledge, bliss, awareness, intention, big part of it. And from that point of view, you could say just living a human life is already a profoundly spiritual act of worship. You know, that wouldn't be an insane thing to say from that point of view. Simply every breath you take being itself underwritten by unity, duality. You know, you're breathing in, you're breathing out, but there's a point where you're not doing either. And can you rest there? Can your consciousness stay there? Can it come from there? Who knows? But it's worth the experiment.
Yeah, definitely. The thing that you said about the new age, quite battlefield organized philosophy. Let's kill the ego and it will free some space for a sage-like creature that hidden below your ego. It will emerge. And sadly, these days you can see many of the, how they call this new profession, Instagram model or Facebook model. So it's, I'm not being sexist, but I'm not seeing the connection between taking a picture of my ass and then writing this below that. I will defeat my ego.
Yes,
And as
not
Satan will
obvious
know,
to me.
we
No.
do. Yeah, yeah. There might be a connection, but I'm not seeing it right now. Hopefully, I will.
Yeah, I'm willing to allow that there's a connection, because everything's connected at some level,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah,
But yeah, it also seems ridiculous.
yeah, but yeah, that's one point. But what I mean is that um, the, the 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 battlefield there. Um, I will give an example through a metaphor that might be simplistic,
Yeah,
or much more simpler than I would
yeah,
probably imagine it to be. But when I'm having a headache, because but let's face it that on one end of the spectrum, life is a headache by itself. It's a natural thing
yeah,
that's going with the system of living, and it hurts the design of this world outside. It's not to care for you anyway. I don't mean the universal life, but I mean the life itself.
yes,
And when I'm having an aspirin, of course, that's treating the symptom, not treating the cause. But I'm not taking the aspirin and then smashing it to pieces and then bulging it in my throat, and then I'm relieved. I'm putting that in a small amount of water, then giving it a little shake, then I'm taking sip by sip. So this is enrolling with the natural
yeah,
context and consequences of one's actions.
yeah,
And as you're saying, with breathing, breath work, extraordinary invention of human beings
yes,
to make sense of your own base level
yes,
of living, and to see what that can do for you,
yeah,
or against you, of course. So I'm imagining defeating the ego in the New Age terms is breathing like
yes, yeah,
heavily until the point of a huge vertigo there, and there's probably the defeat of the ego.
yeah,
If you do it. But I'm joking with that, but I'm quite
yeah.
serious about it.
Well,
It's
and it's
very fortunate.
precisely that, whatever that is that you just named and embodied. It does feel like that's in the zeitgeist almost. It's a mechanism by which the claims to certain types of purity located in me um, actually seem to have the effect of generating more of the very thing I was opposed to. So if I am doing that to destroy my ego, I end up with more ego, or more entrenched, more rigid ego than I had before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem that the vector, primary vector for that, whatever that is identity. And that's a very loaded term these days.
Yeah,
But
there.
yeah, identity is not what we collectively seem to have arrived at as an agreement of what it is. Um, so we suggest that we'll behave a certain way in the name of diversity, and we create less diversity as a result of it. I mean, it's a cosmic joke. It's utterly ridiculous from various
Mm-hmm.
angles and levels. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I have a particularly skewed British kind of angle on it, I'm sure, and I'm me, so I'm
Mm-hmm.
bringing the baggage of that to the party as well. But um, it looks an awful lot like a sort of 17th century Puritanism,
Mm-hmm.
Protestant Reformation. Yeah, Martin Luther nailing the precepts on the door of the cathedral, denouncing, and not that it hadn't happened before then, but that seems like a pretty good reference point for some of that New Age maneuver with the ego. And I mean, there's people like the philosopher John Gray, who's an avowed atheist, but to my mind, continually defeats his own atheism with pursuing his ideas to their ultimate point, and therefore finding himself on the cusp of a spiritual reckoning, but refusing to quite go there. That's how it looks to me, anyway. He makes the point of what he calls hyperliberalism, and this sort of post-Cold War, politically speaking, end of history kind of idea that is deeply, deeply eschatological and puritanical. If we could only just all be pure enough, then heaven on earth would arise. It's basically saying that. in one or other varieties of ways, but in a secularized and materialized kind of form, which, yeah, from other perspectives, makes it an out-and-out blasphemy, really. And that's the mental territory or the psychic territory of the time. And one other thing, I mean, this is probably for another day because these are big, very contemporary things. But a point about let's say an archetypal point. So one of the things that always comes into the firing line would be, in archetypal terms, the kind of Saturn function or the Saturnine function, which in really simplistic terms is the father. You know, we have killed the father and now we're running fatherless riot across everything and everywhere. And also we're desperate for a father at the same time. Now, that doesn't have to be capital F father, doesn't have to be a father in a traditional male body even, but it is reference to the energy, that which Saturn is, which is the structure of space-time reality. You can't remove that. You can't abdicate that any more than you can remove gravity. The fact I don't like it is of zero consequence to it. It's really got neither here nor there, nothing to do. And all of the downside risk of that behavior will accrue to me, and none of it to Saturn in the West, the old man with the sickle who's going to do some harvesting at some point, and Saturn in the East, in the Indian tradition in particular, the Lord of Time, the one who will fix his gaze upon you, and that's all he has to do. You will feel him, whether you wish to or not. So, does this all stack up with a culture, if you can call it that is so addicted to the novel, so addicted to the youthful, that it has no use for aging, it has no use for the wisdom that might accrue to aging if we only reassessed our value with that, but would rather, turn it all over to the young, as it were. Which, if that is the case, then it isn't a culture anymore. It's not. It's a joke. It's not a culture. That's not what cultures do.
Well, that's quite a concerning fact of life, if you ask me. But I'm not sure if it's a fact, but it sounds like one. That all, in terms of ages or in terms of people's state, old equals forgotten.
Yeah.
At one point.
Yeah.
And I wasn't ever able to make sense of that. Why is that?
Yes.
But everything seems to be stuck at one point in time, and we are just adding extra words to bring to the word. So post-modern thinking, post new age, post-modern, and this is an ever expanding perspective. I think this is just easing up our guilt towards that, because I think that's a collective guilt towards abandoning what's traditional, what's old age, what's wisdom.
Wow, that's a genius point. It really is, and that's hidden in plain sight in the language, isn't it? In the terms that we use. That's just to link things together. And this conversation's been doing that all the way through, I think. But you said that, I felt something go through my body. It wasn't in my mind. It's not like I logically agree with the point that Martin is crafting there, and I can see he might go here with it next. No. It was like a visceral, physical shiver through the body, through the form, through the nervous system, which I associate with someone saying something that is true. It's an instinct. It happens with clients. I'm sure it does for you too. When you know someone's telling you something that's real, even if they're telling you a lie.
This is a lie, but this is not, this.
That the thing they're saying that explains something in their suffering or in their story is true, whether it happened or not. It's not about factual events. It's true as in, this is the truth of their being, rather than their action.
Just to add to
Mm.
that feeling, me saying that,
Yes.
uh, it feels at one level, it feels painful.
Yeah.
There's the other level of we being here and crafting something new out of all the domains that we've touched upon, and
Yes.
really for some kind of synthesis, really, or deconstruction and then synthesis.
Yes.
But on this level, this is a very useful thing because we're providing space for one another and then crafting
Yes.
this thing. But on one other level, that's probably this felt experience
Yes.
with you feeling the shivers and with me feeling painfully guilty about saying that. It's probably this layer of, as you mentioned, hidden in plain sight, but as if the subject is resisting you
Yes. Yeah.
to speak about it, to speak of it.
Yeah.
Say, yeah.
Yeah. That's well said. And it makes me, this part of this conversation makes me newly, freshly aware of both at the mundane level or the human interaction level, but also, yeah, all the way up through spiritual level, the absolute necessity of silence.
Yeah.
If you want to receive language, if you want language to really show up and play with you in the profoundest possible sense, you've got to shut up. You've got to be quiet. You've got to kind of go 2 ears, 1 mouth. You need to be listening twice as much as you're speaking.
Yeah.
Or also that kind of indigenous point that I've heard made by different people, but I first heard it from Stephen Jenkinson, where he says, why have you got 2 ears, and why are they not symmetrical? Why are they not identical? One is slightly off from the other. And he said, yeah, the real wisdom understanding of that is because you have 1 ear to hear what's said, and you have 1 ear to hear what isn't said.
Yeah.
Right, do that if you're not being silent. So, yeah, crucial aspect of things there.
Yeah.
But to be silent requires a certain relationship with one's ahamkara, or one's ego. You have to not be in a state of fearful reactivity. You have to be willing to not know what's going to come to you when you're quiet. You have to also not feel like, if I'm not uttering, I don't exist. So you have to trust the donut experience again that we touched on earlier in terms of Almaas and the individuation narcissism. You've got to be able to sit in that donut, so to speak, or so to not speak on this instance. Yeah.
One of the things that I found quite curious, and I've mentioned my newly found but old interest in Wilfred Bion, and
Oh yes,
it's someone that's, well, namely a psychoanalyst, but I'm not quite sure. And with time passing, and with me having the idea that I'm getting something, probably 1.10% of everything. But his life, I'm not sure if I mentioned, sorry, but if I did, but his life in his biography is split in two. The first part is connected directly to Melanie Klein, to the classical psychoanalytic tradition, but at one point, he's really digging into the anatomy of mind. What's what in there, but not the meat of the mind, but what's beyond the metaphysical level of this, namely meat of the mind. And he reaches a point where uh, he has his own nomenclature saying, I will, for the sake of brevity, use symbols to assign meaning to different mind and psychological functions.
Yeah.
Which already defeats the purpose of that. But he has to transfer the knowledge, yes.
Yes.
And probably the symbol for everything, he calls it transformations in O.
Mm.
He uses O not as a graphical representation of something that begins with O, a word or a sentence, But because O is the only figure in the alphabet that's empty,
Yeah.
but has an outline.
Yes.
And he says that transformations in O oftentimes require a solid amount of silence.
Yeah.
Which I think is the same point probably.
Yeah.
And plus, he was born in India, and the first 2 3 years of his life, so he was directly exposed to Indian culture.
Yes.
Then moving to the UK, and then moving to Brazil.
Yes.
But
which is quite a trajectory, isn't it, when you think about
yeah,
it?
just
Yeah,
doing
in
that.
terms of the land and the dwelling in a place-ness of
Mhm.
it. Mm.
So there's something about that, and the other three functions that reaches a point in his second part of life where he's extremely neglected by psychologists, saying he's stupid or senile or crazy or has dementia or something like that. But he reaches a point where he's equating mind processes as mathematical calculus, saying that there are three things with their positive and negative aspects, which is K, L, and H, which is knowledge, love, and hate.
Ah,
And in terms of the new age,
yes.
K slightly emphasized, L heavily emphasized, but
Yeah.
then H, the hateful aspect that we need to grow also, is
Yes.
heavily neglected these days.
Yes.
But without the three, you don't have the transformations. You don't have the donut.
Yes. Yes.
Because what defines a donut for me is the fried dough around the hole.
Yeah.
but not by itself. The donut is the hole.
Yes.
Because if you erase the hole, you're ending up with something else.
Yes.
A completely different kind of pastry or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. The world according to Homer Simpson.
Yeah.
Donuts. Yeah. Yeah. Just I'm jumping back here, just with a memory really to when we were speaking, whenever it was, a certain number of minutes ago in this endless conversation,
Hmm.
which is never about time, but is always about time. the split we were looking at between light entering the eye kind of mind and hearing mind, and of course the the way when we're using vision, like right now, right, my eyes are open, I'm looking at this screen on which I can see you hundreds of miles away. I could hear a dog barking outside, but I'm able to just leave that alone because my eyes are open and I'm focused here. If I close my eyes, that's got a stronger pull on my my consciousness, my awareness, because I'm thinking, is it coming closer to me? What's it doing? Is that two dogs now? And suddenly it's like I can't check, so I have to imagine, fantasize, and it's a more primary, more potent thing. And it made me think. A sort of question floated across my mind, and then a memory came up in answer to it, and it was to do with, other than when fast asleep, when have I ever been in a situation where my eyes are utterly useless to me? And the memory part that came to me, there's a museum, maybe no more than 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now, in a place called Blaenavon, up one of the valleys here, which is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, because it's got the remains of one of the very earliest iron foundries. So it's a kind of iron working and then later steel working place, and a lot of heavy industry background. The whole landscape's dominated by coal tips, slag heaps, as we tend to call them around here. And there used to be many, many coal mines all around that area, that valley, and much further down. But there is still a mine there, and it's now a museum. So it's called, in Welsh, it's called Pwll Mawr, but in English, it's called Big Pit. And it's, a fairly bog standard coal mine, of which there were hundreds, literally hundreds, in that area. But this is the only one left that is still operates. It doesn't do any mining anymore, but you can go there when there's not a coronavirus pandemic, and you can. The attraction is you can go underground. they'll take you down in the cage. You drop down the main shaft, and then you walk the galleries where the coal was extracted, and you see the stables where the pit ponies lived, all the various heavy machinery, and it's done very, very well. The guides are all ex-miners, so they tell their personal stories and the stories of their fathers and grandfathers. It's a really soulful, really deep experience. I did once. I've been down there many times in my life on school trips and cultural exchanges, and taking people down there. Should take you down next time you're here. It's worth it. But I took Stephen Jenkinson down because when he first came here, the weather was so terrible. I was thinking, what could we do? It's just raining so much. Oh, let's go underground where it's dry. So yeah, and he sang a few songs underground. There was a kind of exchange of song with the guide, the miner. But anyway, one of the things everyone who's ever been on this tour knows is that at a certain point, they tell the story of these airflow doors that are at the bottom, which basically section off pieces of the mine so that if there was an explosion, it's contained within a certain section and doesn't rip through the entire mine. And also it's to do with the circulation of air. So when these coal trucks pass along the rails in the Victorian early period, the 1840s, you'd have had children whose job it was, 6-year-olds or whatever, sat there all day by this door, and their job is to open the door when the cart goes through and then shut the door again and then wait for the next one. And they didn't have any light because naked flames, very bad idea, especially in an early coal mine. And there were many explosions with the various gases that you get down there, fire damp and things like this, as they call them. And so, having told this part of the context of the story, and usually, it's pretty compelling, pretty gripping, and you're right there in the spot where all of this stuff was going on. So who's been in total darkness? And, mostly people haven't. Not really. The absolute, utter absence of light. It's okay. Let's do it now then. Everybody, go to your safety helmet where your light is and just right, turn it down. So you do one click and it dims. So it's like half the light there was. And suddenly it's like, wow, we can only just see each other's faces really close in here. And we've got no sense of anything beyond now. And he's like, go on, you all switch yours off. Everyone turns their lights off. So now it's just his little glowing light. And he tells a little bit more of the story and then clicks his light off. And you go from clinging to that kind of one little source of light that feels like the universe to utter blackness. Literally, like you've got no sense of how close your hand is to your own face. All proprioception and things kind of starts to fall apart. And yeah, depending on the guide, they might leave you with that for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes even. And it's a really strange experience to have. And you realize you can't move anywhere because you've got no way of telling if I take a step, do I fall off the end of the earth? And then, of course, you can't help but imagine yourself being that 5 or 6-year-old child who's spending all day in this utterly alone kind of space until you see the little light of a horse-drawn cart coming towards you. And then, you just open a door and it goes past and you stay there. So that seemed to come as a memory that connects some of these, the visual, the hearing, the fear elements that go with it, and the profound things that happen in the dark, if we can put it that way. Yeah. We should do it next time you're able to come to the UK, be down here. We should go and do it. Everyone listening, whenever you can, go to Blaenavon, go down Big Pit. It's free. It's completely without charge. There's a great museum on the surface, and then this underground experience is well worth having.
Yeah, but that brings me back to this reflection that I'm not entirely sure I will be 100% historically accurate, but today's children are far more afraid of the dark than children from probably a century or two ago. Then there was a period with all the wars, with all the burnings, with all the hostile social reality where children were probably again
Yes.
much more afraid of darkness.
Yes.
And then I was really imagining this, coal mine, and if I was 5, let's say, and then
Yes.
I was down there
Yes.
and really struggling for this tiny speck of light
Yes.
to ease up this terror
Yeah.
that's flowing from me.
Yeah.
And if this thing doesn't really come in the foreseeable future of several minutes, that
Yeah.
which is for a child, what will be the outcome at one point?
Yeah.
Will I go crazy out of being overwhelmed
Yeah.
on every level out of that, or will I go uh, much more sane out
Yeah.
of that? Will I be able to reflect? And this probably comes down to the meat of the brain again, because it's insufficiently developed in terms of the self-reflection regions that will allow me to do that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
what is it that will happen at this point if
Yeah.
the speck of light doesn't
Yeah.
arrive at one point?
Yeah. And what? Yeah. Absolutely. What's the difference in that experience as a child versus that experience as an adult? You know,
Yeah.
because they are different. There's no two ways about it. But I can't remember the details. There's a program, BBC Horizon, which is a kind of science magazine documentary program that kind of has
Mm.
seasons. Yeah, Horizon. But reasonably recently, might even have been the very start of this year, they had, well, one of the episodes was to do with basically sensory deprivation. So they had a guy who's a volunteer, a guy called Aldo Kane, who is a ex-Royal Marine Commando sniper, I think, who also runs a kind of, he looks after film crews in extreme terrain. And so he takes them into jungles to make nature documentaries, or canoes down rivers to make, yeah, mostly nature documentaries, or sometimes, kind of Hollywood blockbuster stuff. And I think he's well known for being able to rig ropes in any terrain. So if you need, to scale cliffs or descend gorges or anything like that, he's your man, and he can do it at scale. And yeah, anyway, he'd done loads of things before, like for Horizon, go into an active volcano in
Mm.
full kind of heat reflective kit, and spend some time in there. But for this particular episode, which I can't remember the title of, he goes into a decommissioned nuclear bunker somewhere in wherever it is, Gloucestershire or something, and they've rigged it as a kind of experimental space, and they remove him from the world, basically. So he has, is it 7 days or is it 10 days? I can't remember. At least 7 anyway, in complete darkness. So he's got things to eat. He's just there in darkness in this space, and he's keeping a kind of video journal. Not that you can see anything, but it's the sound. And yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, he does it, and he seems fine. And then he comes out of that and goes into lockdown in in the coronavirus lockdown. So that must have seemed like a doddle. But yeah, well, one of the things I remember hearing him talking about afterwards was he was pretty sure that he'd kept track of time, because he
Mm.
used to, his training in the military was to kind of be in a place and not move for potentially days at a time, and just be present with all your bodily functions and everything else, and just not really move or do anything, and maintain that clarity and sharpness. So he thought he'd kept track of time, but when they came to let him out, he had no idea that it was the end of the experiment. He was still somewhere in the middle of the experiment. He was in that kind of, I'm finding this harder than I thought. It must be about day 6. I've got to keep going
Mm.
for another. How am I going to ration my very meager inner resources over that next? And then the door opens, and they're like, "Come on out." Oh, that's why I was feeling burnt out, because I was, yeah. But so time perceptually seemed to be passing a lot slower, which I guess is not that surprising. minus any kind of reference point or stimulus. So yeah, these endarkenments, we might say, have profound possibility. And it's no accident, is it, that the great classic images of the renunciate, be it in the East or the West, is you go to a cave and you sit alone in the dark and close your eyes and meditate until it all falls away, or until it all falls into you. Yeah, until you shake the whole thing.
Well, bringing back the idea of the unifying center that we mentioned, that I suppose in different approaches, schools of thought, that this same idea or natural process has a different name, and that's fine.
Yes.
I will use the unifying center because this is what I'm used to. But time itself, but not the time-spatial continuum as it is.
Yeah.
The thing in itself about time-spatial continuum, but the social arrangement of time is a unifying center by itself.
Yeah.
But it's quite a false unifying center.
Yeah.
And this experiment, I think, proves it on a certain level, because being left alone and being sensory deprived, well, at least visually, you can probably keep track of them even with military training, and that's extraordinary. As far as I know, this is quite a brutal on the senses training to be able to keep track of them without that or anything. What resembling mechanism.
Yes.
And even the training of the trainings with a capital T will not get you ready for that.
Yes.
But I suppose the overabused term that I use today, the meat of the mind.
That's a great term. I love it.
This same substance cannot, or at least I think it cannot understand that time and space are happening simultaneously at the same time. If you well, this is no experiment, and I'm sure this just has to be forbidden to take a child and try to educate it in the listen now. This 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or seconds, this means nothing. I will tell you how the truth is. Everything flows simultaneously.
Yes.
I'm only fantasizing about the gruesome ending of that. About how a person that grows up will end up. So I suppose we do need that false unifying center just to keep track of everything else. And as you mentioned, this is like the father structure, let's say.
It is, yeah. The Saturn functions always, as far as I can tell, in any culture, tied to time. That's part of its reason for existing and what it's representing back to us. And it makes us ponder things like the linear nature of time, past, present, future, time's arrow, that kind of idea, versus other understandings of time as having cycles or waves or spirals or rhythms, Gaias, so forth. And also, again, another New Age ism, the enormous preponderant emphasis on now, as now. And when is it now? How soon is now, as the Smiths said. Prefer that there's a formulation of it from David Hawkins, I think, from his book, The Eye of the Eye. Just to come back to that little riddle, he rejects the term or the label now and says, try when you want to say the now or now, the power of now, all of that. Instead of that, say always. The always. It's always now. Always. It's just a little kind of hack, but it changes something a little bit. What was I saying? Yeah, but there's something in us that knows time that isn't the mind. So time is not the preserve of the mind. It's like our bodies understand time. You know, for instance, the kind of monthly menstrual cycle is clearly not coming from the mind. I can't think myself into that any more than you can, but the right body can and does express its loyalty to that understanding of time. Just as our kind of, you know, people measure kind of diurnal rhythms in the bioorganism, don't they, or monthly kind of biorhythms to do with cycles of the moon, or effects on blood pressure. So time is having its way with us, whether we conceive of it as kind of wristwatch clock time, or whether it's, like you said, the undoable experiment of deconditioning, or never conditioning a child to time. Yeah. And the final thought on that, because I know ironically we're running out of time, because that's always, as soon as you start to talk about time, there's never enough time. We're always enthralled to the god of more time. But it made me think of, and again, this might well be for another conversation another time. There's that word again. But so there's a lot of civil unrest and disturbance, and, you know, for some people riots, for some people protests, for some people opportunities for bad behavior, for some people spectacle, you know, take your pick really. But there's a lot of that going on out there, and it led me a little bit to reflect on other moments in history where there have been eruptions like that. And yeah, there are some classic big ones, of course, like the October 1917 in Russia, or you've obviously got the French Revolution. But the one that my mind settled on, not because I think it has anything particularly to say about current events, but just a sort of association, were the riots across Europe, in European cities in 1848. So you're at the beginning of that kind of heavy industrial process in lots of those countries. And I guess it's quite underway with the railways and things in Britain and in France to some degree as well. And it's spreading and spreading at an alarming, you know, never before seen kind of rate. And one of the things that's happened that wasn't present to the generation that rebelled or revolted before this one, so prior to the 1840s, was that everywhere had clocks. So every town square, even in the tiny little, you know, market towns, not just the cities, but, you know, everywhere, and everywhere that the railway had reached had many clocks, because the railway timetable is now king, and they're ironing out the disputes between local understandings of time and central capital city understandings of time, especially in France. And so you get this sudden sort of pent-up angry, the injustice of the restored monarchic state, kind of, you know, the birth of nations, all of that erupting, and people rioting, and people kind of doing what they do in mob behavior. And the target of choice for mobs in 1848 was clocks. So if you had a pitchfork or a musket or something, you shoot the clock, you smash the clock, break the clock. And it's not that long ago, is it? Not that far back in the possibilities of history. And yet you can feel people having an experience there that their predecessors didn't have, because they've been owned. From that point onwards, time is money. And your relationship to time is not your relationship to time. It's this abstraction. Yeah. And it's a certain kind of, I suppose if you were getting Marxist about it, you'd say a certain kind of immiseration. People are, there's a production of misery that wasn't there before, that is there post those kind of arisings of clock time, factory time, basically. And all those early, mostly kind of English mill town examples of, or Scottish examples of production lines, and time is money, literally. The quicker we can do this task, this process, the more we can make of the product and of the profit. And in doing so, we automate the human components of this. They're not like workers in charge of their own production and output, they're components in a production line, a pin factory or a matchstick factory or a cotton mill or whatever it might be. Yeah. So it goes to the core. I mean, that's seems to me a lot of the globalizing tendencies in industry and trade and commerce and in psychology are there because of this type of understanding of time and of work and its relationship to time. And you know, our business of like hourly rates or the 50-minute hour, the therapeutic hour, these are contrivances and artifices that come about through those sort of almost Jeremy Bentham kind of utilitarian understandings of something, whereas we're maybe riffing here on the idea of time as a much deeper, more mysterious structure.
I think so, yeah. This is probably well, I'm not excluding the contemporary point, the postmodern, idealized idea of time. It's useful just to live life as it is these days, to keep track of transportation, commuting, and then where you're getting your salary if you're working this kind of cycle.
Yeah.
But then I think we have forgotten about time.
Yeah.
Probably with a capital T, if we are aiming at this idea with the spiritual context of timing and of becoming and of everything else. And I'm being remembering recently, just final words about, I know we are running out. But recently I've been remembering that the Western tradition in thinking about time, and this is oftentimes connected to physics or quantum mechanics or whatever the Western tradition produced as in terms of context for thought. And each and every single scientist or philosopher or spiritual teacher, whatever, that reached time, but not in terms of I will begin thinking about time and I will see where that will lead me. They have a vast history of thinking about or pondering on every single other thing than time. And at one point, all of them reach time.
Yeah.
But the curious bit is that time is never on its own.
Yeah.
So, for example, I mentioned Gilles Deleuze several times.
Yeah.
He equals time with becoming.
Yeah.
Equals time with contraction, as we mentioned last time.
Yeah.
So he defines the human being as a becoming animal. Or even writes it somewhere saying timely becoming animal. Then there's the, I think Blaise Pascal, he calculated something that if you have a bad occurrence in one day, and then if you have a second one, the mathematical probability of having a third one rises by hundreds of percentages. This is around time. He also found the formula of eating cake properly, but that's another story.
I'm interested to hear more about that one.
It's very brief, and I will outline it here. When you slice the cake, the tradition is to go as in V-shaped form pieces. But then if you don't eat the cake fully, from start to finish, it will probably go stale, and you won't enjoy it the next day. So he... fingers crossed it was him, said that you're having the circular cake, let's say.
The traditional cakes shape,
It will work with the square one, actually, but you're having the circular one, and you're cutting two parallel slices through the diameter of it. Then you're eating the middle part, and you're reconnecting the two, one from each and every. On the next day, you flip it by 90 degrees. You cut the same one. It shrinks, and the diameter shrinks, the radius shrinks. So you're ending with a tiny fresh cake on the last day of eating. And this is enlisted in a mathematical.
That's brilliant.
Praised by mathematicians, and they say, "Well, yeah, this is it.
This is the way to eat cake." Yeah. Well, you could say let them eat cake, or you could say this is the secret of how to have your cake and eat it.
And eat it too. Yeah. But my point was that each and every of the people that I've reached in terms of knowledge, really wondering about what time is, they always connected to some other vital, very
Yes.
crucial process in being.
Yes.
Um, time, motion, as in one word.
Yeah.
Even Hermann Heisenberg, he had something around time with his famous,
Uncertainty.
yeah.
Yeah.
This might be me
Mm.
choosing to read people that reach that
Yeah.
consensus, but they come from very different traditions. So if it's my own sensory or memory filter that's really grouping them, I apologize, but I'm not really certain that this is the thing. They're far too different
Yes.
in
Exactly.
terms of
Exactly.
how they conceive their own ideas.
Well,
Great.
that feels like a very fitting note to end our recording
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
So, thanks, Martin. Let me just hit
Thank you,
the
Keith.
stop button. I will see you again next week.
Next week. Yeah.